All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Spencer Overton. I'm a law professor at George Washington University, and I focus on voting rights. Welcome. There are a lot of good panels at this time, so I'll tell you, thank you very much for being here. We love you. We appreciate you. We look forward to your questions. You are appreciated. So what we're going to do today is we're going to basically have some questions, some back and forth here, and then we're going to move on to opening it up to the audience here in terms of questions. So I hope you all have a lot of penetrating questions for our panelists. And let's go ahead and get started. I'll start off with a few questions here. And let me start first with Michael Waldman. Michael is the executive director of the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a legal policy and advocacy organization that's played a leading role in voter protection efforts. Another interesting note, in the late 1990s, Michael was director of speechwriting for President Bill Clinton. And so, Michael, we're going to start with you. I know that the Brennan Center has done quite a bit in terms of voting machines and extensive reports here. And right now there's a federal bill on voting machines. Could you just let us know, what does the bill do? You know, why is it necessary? What's the status of it? Could you just give us a quick overview in terms of the machine issue?
Absolutely, and thank you, Professor Overton. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I will be brief, but as he said, I did work on those State of the Unions for Bill Clinton, so, you know, settle in.
I'm sorry I didn't include that in the bio.
The Brennan Center, among the many pieces of the voting work that we've done, have taken a look at something that's of great concern to ordinary citizens, in some ways more emotionally so, more intensely so than a lot of the election protection, a lot of the election administration matters that we all know are critically important, and where we believe that there's a huge opportunity for law reform and things that you all can get involved in. Since Florida in 2000 and the debacle there, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, and this changed the way elections were administered all across the country, and it put in place a set of requirements. And mostly as a consequence of this, now 80% of voters across the country vote on electronic machines of one kind or another. And as you know, there's a lot of worry about it. We convened a task force of top scientists and election security experts from inside and outside the government, including the National Institute of Standards and Technology, including Howard Schmidt, who was President George W. Bush's cybersecurity czar. And we asked, are these worries founded? Do the paranoids in fact have enemies? Are these machines secure? And this task force came back emphatically and unanimously that every single one of the electronic voting systems now being used are insecure, are unacceptably insecure. They are susceptible to code being inserted. They're susceptible to all kinds of problems. And most alarmingly of all, because in all but 2 states it is legal for these machines to have wireless components, in many places you could walk into a polling place with a Palm Pilot and trigger an attack that could turn the result of a close statewide election. It's an unacceptable situation. The good news is there's a consensus that has really grown together on this, that these machines have some real benefits. They are in many ways potentially much better than the system that we saw in Florida, which had its and all the other kind of slapdash voting systems that you had, but that there are fixes that can be done. That's the good news. The fixes principally revolve around, first off, banning those wireless components, but more significantly, requiring an audit trail, as it's called, which colloquially would be a paper trail, so that voters can check whether their vote was accurately recorded. And just as important, it turns out, not just that record, but that there be random auditing to check the paper records against the actual tallies. Without the audit, it doesn't work. This is embodied in legislation that is now federal legislation. Most of the changes we're all going to be talking about involve state law. But federal legislation, it's introduced in the House of Representatives by Representative Rush Holt, a Democrat of New Jersey, The lead co-sponsor is Representative Tom Davis, a Republican of Virginia, who, among other things, was the chair of the National Republican Campaign Committee. And this is unlike some of these other issues where there's a real partisan divide. This is genuinely bipartisan. It's slogging its way through Congress. There are huge complications ranging from the local officials who don't want to pay for it and who feel it's an unfunded mandate, to disability rights groups who are concerned that the benefits, the breakthrough from some of these machines will be lost. And so it's complex. It's very much on the edge. We don't know what's going to happen. I was asking some of my colleagues from the Brennan Center where some of the things stood, and basically, minute by minute, we don't know or we can't say. So there's a chance that this could happen, but of course, it's quite precarious.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's, Penda. As you very well know, you are the co-director for the Advancement Project. You supervise the Advancement Project's Voter Protection Program, which focuses on pre-election troubleshooting and identifying barriers to the franchise before Election Day. So these barriers, Penda, you know, what are they? What is voter caging? We all hear about this. Why is caging a problem? Can you explain to us, just kind of in layperson's terms, what are the big things that we're worried about here, that at least the civil rights groups are worried about in terms of voter suppression now?
Sure. Well, let me start with some of the barriers. Before a voter even gets to the point of voting, whether on an electronic machine or otherwise, they have to surmount a number of barriers. And those barriers are particularly harsh and more difficult for some racial groups and economic groups than others to surmount. The biggest barrier is registration itself. And having to register 30 days in advance of an election is itself a barrier. On top of that, the Help America Vote Act added a requirement that you provide a 4-digit identification number if you're a newly registered voter, and that you have to provide certain ID if you're a newly registered voter, and that's an additional barrier. It might not seem like a barrier to us who have all sorts of IDs in our purses when we travel on airplanes, but there is a great deal of data that these kinds of requirements, first, just having that number, which is either your driver's license number or your Social Security number, has led states to then try to match that number with the driver's license or the Social Security database, and it's resulted in the disenfranchisement of thousands of voters because there are errors in the databases. And if you report your middle initial differently, or if you're married and you haven't changed your name in one of the other of the databases, or there's some other small problem with the information that you put down, then you will not match, and that will disenfranchise you and keep you from being able to register. Voter registration groups that go out and affirmatively assist voters in registering are under attack, and states have done things like impose huge penalties. Florida, for example, which the Brennan Center and Advancement Project litigated together, tried to impose huge penalties on voter registration groups if they made a mistake and forgot to turn in a single form. And so in 2006, there was virtually no voter registration in Florida, sort of affirmative voter registration in Florida for almost the entire year until we got an injunction just a few weeks before the election. So I could go on, polling place management, there are training of poll workers. Every single step that requires the voter to take an additional affirmative action is going to discourage some voters and disenfranchise voters. In terms of voter caging, my word for it is an old-fashioned word, which is voter suppression. And I don't know who came up with this caging language, but it's definitely hot in the media these days. And basically, it's just another variation on a theme we've seen for a long time. And as I understand, the current variation, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, is a partisan or not group will mail a letter or postcard to voters who are registered, and then if the mail comes back as non-deliverable, then they will try to challenge those voters and either keep them from being registered or keep them from voting. And we've seen schemes like this going back to Jesse Helms in the 1980s in North Carolina, did such mailings, and those were found racially discriminatory And in violation of the Voting Rights Act in New Jersey in the 1990s, the Republican Party did the same thing. And Advancement Project in 2004 was able to go back, reopen that New Jersey case and actually get an injunction to prevent such challenges in Ohio, because there were efforts to challenge like almost 40,000 Ohio voters based on these postcards or mailings, and there's all sorts of mistakes and reasons why mail doesn't get delivered, and it doesn't mean that you're not an actual voter that deserves to participate.
Okay. Thank you. I want to turn toward Allison Hayward, who is a law professor at George Mason University. She focuses on campaign finance, internet regulation, government ethics, and legal ethics. She served as the in-house attorney for the National Republican Congressional Committee, and she also served on the staff of the Senate Special Investigation of the 1996 federal election campaigns, which was chaired by Fred Thompson here. So, Allison, liberals routinely say...
Are there any?
I don't know. So they say that measures to curb fraud are solutions in search of a problem, they would say. Hey, how about that? Is voter fraud really a problem? Is it just, some mythical beast like a unicorn, or is it, is there a problem?
Well, I think that's a provocative question. I mean, first of all, observe that after you heard that introduction, you probably understand why I'm on the right end of the podium here today. And I was also going to observe that I've never been to an American Constitution Society meeting before, but I am a card-carrying member of the Federalist Society. And I noticed that your motto for this meeting is toward a just future. I think maybe ours is something like toward an unjust past or something like that. Be that as it may. Be that as it may. Anti-fraud measures take as many different forms as the kinds of fraud that we've been able to invent as political hacks and campaigns and folks through time have been able to come up with. So let's first of all think about the different kinds of fraud there might be. There may be fraud in registration. That first barrier can be an opportunity to put in extra additional information, the Washington State prosecution being just the latest example of that. There's nothing new about this. The Republicans, for their part, have had problems in Southern California with fraudulent voter registration, and it's something that has been part of the template of things one might do to mess in elections since we've had official registration rolls. Now remember, at one point in American history, there was no voter registration. Communities were small, people largely knew who was there, who belonged there, you showed up to vote. It's my understanding that there are some jurisdictions in the U.S. even today that don't require voter registration. Is that correct? I was going to say, I thought it was North Dakota, but I didn't want to say, so anyhow. So this is not an essential thing, but yet almost every jurisdiction has it. So there's that. Then there can be fraud in casting a vote, to the extent that you are in a jurisdiction that permits liberal absentee balloting now, or casting fraudulent votes on Election Day. That can be personation fraud. That can be using ballot carriers in other contexts. And then, of course, after the canvass, there can be the kind of fraud that you're concerned about when you're concerned about electronic voting machines, of somebody taking an otherwise well-executed election and doing something with the result before the official tabulation is done. So here's steps along the way and different sorts of ways that you can mess with them. And the anti-fraud measure that seems to get the most attention from people right now is the voter ID requirement. The requirement that you have a photo ID when you show up to vote, issued by a governmental agency. Typically it's a driver's license or a government ID card. Typically people have to pay for those. People who criticize voter ID look at this and they say, oh, that's like a poll tax because somebody's had to pay something in order for them to exercise their right to vote. Other people say, well, the people who vote are also the people who already have these sorts of things, so it really isn't that big a burden. But the point of it is is fraud a problem argument has the most bite in I think this context, because you've got a fairly readily identifiable solution to what is but a part of voter fraud, personation fraud. That is, somebody going in pretending to be somebody they're not and voting that person's ballot, either pretending to be somebody that doesn't exist at all or pretending to be somebody who you, for one reason or another, know isn't going to show up to vote, and so the likelihood of you being caught is rather low. And so I'm not, as you probably can tell from the, sort of the tone of this analysis, one of these people who thinks that picture voter ID is a necessary and complete solution to voter fraud. Because I don't think there is a necessary and complete solution to voter fraud. We will see voter fraud so long as there's an incentive for people to try and mess, and a feeling that those sorts of activities are going to go undetected. So there are things that assist with this. First of all, having a competitive race makes it much more likely people are going to try at the margins to play with the results. But we like competition. We like deliberative democracy and argument and debate and a chance that one side might win and the other side might lose. We don't want rotten boroughs in this country, so that's not something that I'm suggesting we change through malapportionment or something to get rid of competition. No, competition's a good thing. So you'll have that incentive to participate, or some people will have the incentive to participate fraudulently. So let's start addressing some of the tools by which those frauds are committed, like messy voter rolls with a lot of information in them that is incorrect. Let's look at professionalizing election staff, which I'm totally in agreement with, having been a precinct captain in California for several years. In a small and stable precinct, I do not know how precinct captains cope with precincts where there's a lot of movement in and out, as, say, in a fast-growing southwestern United States, or a place where you've got people moving out, say the upper Midwest. There's unfortunately not a public consensus to make the kind of investment for these improvements to occur. So we're going to have to settle with some second-best solutions. To the extent that voter ID requirements make people feel better about elections, there might be some therapeutic advantage there that I'm not sure anyone can measure. But there also might be just sort of a resignation at some point that elections can be good, but they're not going to be perfect. Because if we're not going to invest the necessary, public money into a unified, clean voter roll and professional elections administration, I think most of what we're talking about is going to persist over time.
Okay, thank you very much. Bill Yeomans is Chief Counsel to Senator Ted Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Bill's also spent 24 years in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. He's also been the Director of Programs here at ACS in the past, so a lot of experience here. And Bill, I'm hoping that you can frame for us this U.S. attorney situation in terms of the firing of the U.S. attorneys, any connection to voting, the role of DOJ in voting, and also what's the role of Congress in addressing these issues, just from a big picture standpoint.
Sure. I think that the U.S. attorney scandal, as it's sometimes called, has opened up just a picture window on enormous problems that go well beyond U.S. attorneys. But one of the things I think that the picture we've gotten drives home when you step back from it is that there is an enormous potential at the federal level to use federal voting laws that have been developed and added over the years for partisan purposes. And that's very much what we've seen, I think, from this Justice Department. Dealing with the U.S. attorneys themselves, there are strong indications that at least two of them, and maybe more, were removed in part because they didn't pursue voter fraud cases with sufficient aggression. Now, I don't think that that was based on an analysis of whether there was sufficient evidence to bring the cases. It was simply a notion that whoever was making these decisions wanted voter fraud cases pursued. and that's part, I think, of a bigger political agenda. But one of the reasons that that was possible is that in this administration we have seen a real collapse in the wall that has traditionally separated the White House from the Department of Justice. In the old days, when Michael was still in government, there was a very strong division between the White House and the Department of Justice. There were designated people, and it was only a handful of people who could speak back and forth. There were maybe a half dozen in the Justice Department and a half dozen in the White House, and they might bring in hangers-on for particular projects, but that was the communication. If you look at it now, and this was driven home again this week when the Attorney General came up to testify in the Judiciary Committee, it's wide open. There are hundreds of people at the White House who can now call up somebody at the Justice Department about an ongoing case. That's wrong. What that does is to introduce the possibility that enforcement of the law is going to be driven by partisan interests. And I think that's very much what we saw in the U.S. attorney firings. Probably the two that stand out as being most connected to voter fraud are David Iglesias in New Mexico and John McKay in Washington. Iglesias had been criticized after the 2004 election for not pursuing voter fraud cases, and he had set up a task force and had done what looked like a fairly exemplary job of investigating and trying to figure out whether there were prosecutable cases, and he decided not to prosecute any cases, and that did not sit well with the White House. John McKay, same thing after the 2004 election. The governor's race there was decided by something like 150 votes, so it became a very high priority to try to figure out how to either reverse that result or make sure it didn't happen again. Once again, he was expected to bring voter fraud cases. He investigated. He didn't bring cases. There's a clear trail that shows that their failure to proceed on voter fraud was an element in their removal. Voting partisanship is very obvious in other areas as well. I think Penda talked earlier about caging. One of the people who has been alleged to have been involved in caging, and we don't know for sure, there are allegations, in 2004 was a guy named Tim Griffin, who actually was the director of research for the RNC, and then went on to work in the White House with Karl Rove. He was selected to replace the U.S. Attorney in Arkansas, Bud Cummins, and the Deputy Attorney General came right out and said that Bud Cummins was removed because they wanted to put Tim Griffin in Arkansas. Now, it's hard to imagine that they wanted Tim Griffin in Arkansas for reasons that were not connected to voting. And there is a pattern that you see throughout the U.S. Attorney replacements where there are young, fairly partisan folks, many of them being sent out from Washington, many of them from the Civil Rights Division, to battleground states to become U.S. attorneys. We had Brad Schlossman go to Missouri. We had Matt Dummermuth go to Iowa. We had Rachel Paulus go to Minnesota. We had Alex Acosta go to Florida. So there seems to be a pattern there. And the suspicion is heightened simply because this wall that has traditionally kept the White House out of the Department of Justice's business is pretty much gone.
Thank you. Now, Bill, let me ask you a follow-up on that, though. And really, this is Bill and Penda here, which is, what's wrong with having enforcement priorities? What's wrong with saying, hey, fraudulent voting is wrong, we want it prosecuted? And, similarly, Penda, along those lines, you're not saying fraudulent votes should be counted, are you? What do you propose that we do about double voting, about bloated voting rolls here? Obviously it's debatable how much voter fraud there is that's out there, but, shouldn't we address the voter fraud that exists? And if an administration makes a policy decision to say, hey, we're going to go after voter fraud, it's against the law, what is wrong with that?
Can I go first?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. There's nothing wrong with going after voter fraud. None of us, I'm sure nobody in this room supports voter fraud. The danger is when you make it too high a priority. because inevitably, almost any measure you pursue to go after voter fraud has some vote suppression aspect to it. That's an almost inevitable effect. So if you make fighting voter fraud, your highest priority, you are inevitably going to suppress votes. And if you use targeted voter fraud programs, you can suppress votes in certain communities. So it can become a very powerful partisan tool. And I think that's the problem. One example is the way that the campaign against voter fraud has been used to justify photo ID laws. Photo ID laws in the abstract make some sense. When you look at them in practice, they are not a good thing because they do tend to suppress the votes of minorities and the elderly and people with disabilities simply because they're not as likely to have the ID. But one reason that we have seen state after state try to enact photo ID laws is that the foundation has been laid by this consistent drumbeat that we have this huge problem out there with voter fraud. It's been exaggerated, and it's been exaggerated for political purposes, so that we'll then have photo ID laws, which then suppress what turn out largely to be Democratic votes.
But Bill and Penn, I want to give you a chance, but Bill, I think Republicans would say, hey, strict enforcement of environmental laws sometimes suppresses economic development and economic growth. And they would say, hey, that's a problem. We have a different policy priority. But they wouldn't say that this is, nefarious or somehow Democrats are being evil by enforcing these laws in this way. They wouldn't paint, Democrats in this picture of being kind of self-serving or evil in some way. Isn't this just an enforcement priority and just different value judgments in terms of different folks? Just like, again, some people say we need strict enforcement of environmental laws. Other people would say that strict enforcement, suppresses economic development.
Well, I would say there's nothing wrong with having enforcement priorities. There's nothing wrong with doing some voter fraud enforcement. I think the problem is when you make it the be-all and end-all, when you exaggerate the size of the problem, when you go after it with large resources, and when you create this impression in the country that there is a huge voter fraud problem. It also justifies other policies and other actions and things that you can think of. For instance, most people in the room are probably familiar with the Section 5 preclearance of the Georgia Photo ID law. First of all, there was a Georgia Photo ID law that was made possible because of this great concern about voter fraud. And then it's able to pass off the notion that the Georgia Photo ID law doesn't violate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because people have been sold on this notion that we really have to do something about voter fraud. So it has consequences.
Yes, I would argue that the right to vote should not be like the right to have an economic operation or enforce environmental laws. And that's because the right to vote is really the foundation of our democracy. And one of the points I wanted to make in this panel is that we actually do not have a right to vote in the U.S. Constitution, and a lot of people don't know that. But one of the things that Advancement Project has been looking at is what it would mean and what it would take to try to push for a real solid right to vote that it would be put in the Constitution via constitutional amendment. That would obviously be a long-term strategy. But in terms of enforcement priorities and things like that, I think that the right to vote is so precious that you should not be able to tamper with it without clear and convincing evidence that you have a real problem. And what we have in this country is we have a lot of allegations, and as Bill said, a media campaign to suggest that there is a huge amount of voting fraud. In fact, the evidence shows that fraud is rarely ever committed by individual voters who either decide to register when they're not eligible, or they decide to take to try to take somebody's identity and go and vote. fraud, to the extent that we know that it has been committed by political campaigns on both sides of the aisle, and it's usually through absentee ballot, manipulation of absentee ballot at the mega level, not at the individual voter level. And so all of these remedies that are being thrust upon us that are really infringing on the right to vote are not directed toward the right problem. In fact, the ID laws typically exempt you from showing the kind of photo ID that's required if you vote by absentee ballot. So that the place where there's more likely to be fraud is not the place where the remedies are directed.
I'd actually like to, Michael, I want to actually ask you and Penda actually a question and kind of follow up on this. And it's about just like individual responsibility, which is, 70% of Americans believe, over 70% believe a photo ID is a reasonable requirement. What's wrong if government says, hey, we're giving out free ID? Isn't it reasonable just to say people should get an ID and go to the polls, or people should go online and check their registration and make sure it's spelled right in advance, that kind of thing? Isn't everyone subject to the same requirement here? I mean, that's not discriminatory, is it, if everyone has to go through the same hoop and the same hurdle? And isn't that reasonable? Isn't that different than, a poll tax? Or isn't that different than saying, hey, there's a literacy test? We have ID in terms of getting on airplanes and a variety of other, and I'll obviously note here that my questions don't necessarily reflect the views of the questioner, but are intended for, entertainment purposes only. So I'll open that up.
The difference with ID for airplanes is there were actual hijackings. It does, at some level, go back to the question at first blush of whether this is a solution that's far greater in magnitude and its impact in a negative way than the problem it's seeking to solve. And so I think that's the first layer of analysis has to include that. More broadly, of course, we want to make sure that people are who they say they are when they vote, and it's not unreasonable for that to be in some way some way for people to verify who they are. And there are all kinds of ways of doing that, including signatures, including all kinds of other things. But the issue is not, and there's even broad ID requirement in the Help America Vote Act for new registrants, which is not only government-issued photo ID, but other forms of ID, range any kind of government ID, including a veteran's card, including Social Security, or other proof of who you are and where you live, such as a utility bill. There are an array of ways to make sure that people are who they say they are. It's important not to get caught up in the general notion of wanting people to be who they are, but particularly and specifically, what are the proposals that are being pushed? And the proposals focus on ID that a lot of people just don't have. We look at Katrina and we say, well, why didn't the people in New Orleans just drive away? Remember, that was something people said a lot, and then people said, well, gee, a lot of people don't have cars. Well, the people who don't have cars, a lot of them don't have driver's licenses. I live in New York City. Most people don't have driver's licenses, or many people don't have driver's licenses. Vast numbers of Americans have neither a passport nor their birth certificate, which are the requirements for proof of citizenship. These do cost money, especially the proof of citizenship, up to $200 to get these kinds of forms of identification. And the poll tax, by contrast, when it was declared unconstitutional in 1966, in current dollars, was $8.97. So when people call it a poll tax, it's not just rhetoric, it's math. And the poll tax and the literacy tests were not explicitly targeted at one group or another. They just were, in fact, targeted at one group or another. And unfortunately, that's the consequence of these kinds of ideas.
And I'll give you a chance to respond to it, but, people have to wait in line 30 minutes to vote. People have to register 30 days in advance. These are all requirements we have of voting. I mean, are you all saying that these are improper or unconstitutional or should be abolished either for constitutional or policy purposes? I mean, where do we draw the lines between what's a reasonable and unreasonable voting requirement? And I ask that to Michael and Penda.
As a policy matter, we think that the country ought to move toward a system of universal voter registration where if you're a citizen and you're 18, the government takes it upon itself to register you to vote, just as they do in compiling all kinds of other things. I don't know that that's a constitutional claim that we would make, but we think it should be as easy as possible for people to vote. Yes.
Yes, and I agree. I mean, and you know, at least since the Voting Rights Act was passed, and even before, we've been at war in this country over who gets allowed to vote. And the arguments were made first that you had to own property, you had to be male, and then as different waves of immigrants came into the country, there were different restrictions that were brought into play, and at each level, it seems like there are just efforts to make voting more and more difficult in order to allow those who have the power to keep the power. So my position is we need to really push back in the opposite direction. We need a pro-democracy movement in this country that is affirmative, because right now we are in a defensive stand and we just keep fighting, you know, in the trenches. We fight, I mean, 30-minute lines might not be a problem, but the 9-hour lines in Ohio in 2004, to me, definitely violated the Voting Rights Act and probably the Constitution. And somewhere between 15 minutes, which I think would be ideal, and 9 hours, that line can be drawn. And I would draw it closer to, you know, 1 hour than 9 hours. Because standing in line for 9 hours in the rain is definitely a discouragement and a burden on voting. And I didn't have to do that when I went to my little, you know, majority white polling place in Montgomery County, Maryland. And so I was privileged in voting compared to those people who had to stand in line.
But there are some people who would say it is more burdensome for me to stand in line for an hour than it is for me to show an ID, right? And so, you know, again, where do we draw the line? Why isn't 15 minutes or half an hour? Why isn't that too burdensome?
Well, I think if we had a right to vote, then the definition would be what's a compelling governmental interest in burdening the right to vote. If the government shows that it costs too much money or they can't have 15-minute or 30, you know, lines, then maybe they're allowed to have more. And the same would be true on an ID. What's the governmental interest in the ID, and is it compelling? But until we have an affirmative protection of the right to vote, we're just going to be, you know, hit from right and left with everything from inept election administration to underfunded election administration to intentional efforts to suppress the vote, all of which really dampen down participation and hurt the participation of minority groups and the poor.
Allison, a lot of campaign finance reform skeptics have skeptics, I use that word. You have a blog, it's a blog, what's your blog called?
Skeptic's Eye.
Okay. Have a
www.skepticseye.com.
Have a libertarian take, right? They believe that regulation, campaign finance reform, it chills.
All the nice ones do, yeah.
What's that? Right, I mean, yeah, I've heard that before from you and from Commissioner Smith and some others. And that it entrenches incumbents, that regulation entrenches incumbents. You know, what do you say to people who would say these voter ID regulations and other voter fraud regulations that make it more difficult to register voters, that these chill legitimate participation and they essentially entrench incumbents, that you got some incumbents who feel like people who don't have ID are going to vote against them, and as a result they enact these barriers, not unlike you know, campaign reform skeptics who would say, well, you know, the incumbents just don't want to be challenged by anyone with money. I mean, is the appearance of voter fraud any more substantive than the appearance of corruption, right, that campaign reform activists? I mean, to be consistent, wouldn't a libertarian have to say no campaign finance reform and no voter ID requirements?
Actually, I think a consistent libertarian probably would. A consistent libertarian might have problems with voter registration altogether, and maybe even the requirement that you have to vote at a particular place, and you have to say that your residence is a particular place. Why couldn't you, you know, decide to participate in a Montgomery County election if you live in Fairfax? You know, because you're more interested in what's happening in Montgomery County. You've got traditional, you know, ties there. Whatever. You know, the Knight Statesman libertarian view is theoretically very appealing and not functional. So, getting to the functional things that might happen, I think the problem with the
Well,
The
why
comparison
is
seems to me-
unlimited contributions and spending functional, but, you know, a lack of photo ID is not functional? Why
No,
why
no,
are
no,
those
I
two?
meant the Night Watchman state generally, that
Uh-huh,
would prohibit the state's authority to, sanction marriage, to sanction voter registration, to sanction a whole host of things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not functional. What I think the difference is here is the difference between the expression of political actors and the way that the people, the audience gets to express its view. Now, certainly campaigns have a lot to say about turnout, but typically it's not the people that the campaigns have identified. I mean, I can think of exceptions right now historically, but in an ordinary election, say, to the extent we have those anymore, the people that the campaign knows about and is going to mobilize aren't going to be the chilled people. It's the people on the margins that you're worried about. And it's not clear at all to me that there is a predictive trend there. I mean, if you don't know, if they're not voting, you don't know how they vote. Now, you can do some survey work and you can draw some conclusions about that, but you also don't know why they're not voting necessarily. And it could be that with greater access, suppose, for example, let's get away from the voter ID stuff, but suppose, for example, we make Election Day a holiday, or we move Election Day through amendment to a Saturday. So it's a lot easier for people to vote. Or in Oregon, we make elections by mail. It's a lot easier for people to vote. What happens? Well, what's happened in Oregon anyway is the social demographics that already vote more. And so there's sort of a drowning out effect if what you're interested in is getting people who are sort of outside the mainstream brought into the process of voting. There's sort of a drowning out. So I haven't answered your question directly because I'm not sure I know what the answer is, but I think there are interesting differences between voter bona fides and the ability to campaign that make the comparison sort of inapt.
But, I mean, isn't it at least as important for us to hear from the 30 million people who are on the margins that you talk about as to hear from the, an unlimited way from the 2% of people who give political contributions to candidates?
The problem is, for a variety of reasons, those people don't want to show up and vote.
But,
Either because they don't believe that it'll make any difference, because they don't believe it'll make any difference. Maybe it's cynicism. Maybe it's because they feel
But they do. They just don't have their photo ID. Or maybe they,
Well, we don't have the photo ID requirement now. We still have, poor voter turnout in many jurisdictions.
Michael,
So,
did you have a point?
Just very, very quickly, and we at the Brennan Center are nonpartisan. This is a nonpartisan gathering. Not everybody got the memo. The recently departed political director of the Republican Party of Texas told the Houston Chronicle in an article published May 17th, he said, basically, voter fraud, there's no voter fraud, but the ID requirements that come out of the push for voter fraud depress the legitimate Democratic vote enough to add 3 points to the Republican total. Mm-hmm. He was thinking quite strategically about it, that it affected certain groups and with certain partisan proclivities more than others.
So Michael, with that, I mean, why is that wrong? I mean, we've got gerrymandering that is out there. Don't all parties have the same opportunity to do this? Certainly Democrats, for example, target African Americans to mobilize them to the polls, not because they're concerned. I mean, maybe they do that in primaries if they were really concerned about voting rights. But, they do that in general elections to benefit themselves. They manipulate the size of the electorate in a very intentional way. And so what is wrong with a photo ID that's designed not to discriminate because, hey, we don't like those black people, but because, hey, they're going to vote Democratic. That's our suspicion. And just like gerrymandering, and just like we know how they're going to vote in terms of gerrymandering, we want to exclude them. And when their party gets in, they can exclude, white Republican voters.
There's just a huge and obvious difference between excluding people and bringing people into the process. And I think that's the answer. I think it's legitimate, obviously, you can call it manipulation, but to take steps to get people to vote. I mean, that's a real, I think, positive for our polity. I think any measure that keeps people from getting to the polls is a negative. And certainly any measure that's targeted is a double negative.
So you think, for example, a gay marriage ban proposal that is designed to mobilize voters is a fine and good thing. It increases turnout, and that's a good thing.
Look, being completely nonpartisan, certainly that's fair game. Things that get people to the polls are fair game.
Spencer, I just wanted to respond to your question concerning sort of partisan versus racial intent and impact. Because in my experience as a voting rights lawyer, both political parties have looked, and my experience mostly is with African American voters, have looked to manipulate African American voters for political partisan interests. Democrats did it a lot in redistricting. I've sued Democrats, I've sued Republicans, and I think. But my point is that it is, in my view, it's illegal and immoral to focus on a particular racial group and to disadvantage that racial group for partisan purposes. And the Voting Rights Act makes that very clear, because the Voting Rights Act has a results test. You don't have to prove that there was racial intent. In fact, in many redistricting cases that I've worked on, if we can show that there was partisan intent to put black voters into a particular district in order to pack them or stack them or do something else with them that would favor a white incumbent, that's illegal. And I think that that's just different from other types of partisan manipulation that may go on and be subject to a different test, either constitutionally or morally.
Well, Allison, what about that? If we know that some of these devices are passed, not to, let's say, advance integrity, and I know this is a hypothetical, you're, as a professor, well aware of the value of a hypothetical, but they're advanced for, let's say, political reasons. Is that okay? Should the political process just deal with those issues, or should courts be especially suspect of measures passed for partisan purposes to decrease turnout in particular areas?
I think it's hard to remove the politics from politics. Having said that, it is also important to get past a legacy that has kept people out of the voting pool. We're not there yet. But I just, you say, is it okay? I think a political party should do what the political party has the legal ability to do to further its candidates' goals. I mean, that's what they're for. And I have a real problem just generally with overarching prohibitions in this area, because they can be manipulated too. I mean, nobody in the process stands in a privileged non-political position. Not the judges, not the parties, not the candidates, not the election administrators. Everybody got there for a reason. And what concerns me more about sort of the way some of the reform stuff is going is the centralization of authority and standards.
Is that all reforms or just some reforms?
No, just, some reforms. But it just seems to me that really does put the power in fewer hands in a smaller basket. I mean, because this is one of the other things people complain about in this area is how much state discretion there still is, and why there aren't these national uniform standards. And, well, the court should give us a national uniform standard because we can't trust Congress. Congress is a bunch of politicians, after all. Maybe I'm not so sure. I think the fact that we have different felon voting standards in different states may be fine.
So a federal photo ID requirement would be a problem.
Yeah.
And how about universal registration? Where are you on universal registration and/or election day registration?
I want to see some sort of mechanism for registration that shows that the person has shown some deliberation in deciding to register, and that they are not being coaxed at the last moment to register for some other more, more corrupt situation.
Why is that? I mean, for example, if I want to persuade you to vote for my candidate, how is that any different than me persuading you to go out to vote at the last minute on Election Day?
Well, but if you're already registered, then that shows some, by the 30-day close or whatever, it shows some deliberation on your part, or at least you've had some time to think about it. I think, voter registration was a reform itself to get a hold of machine politicians, mobilizing people, asserting they were people who they weren't, and flooding districts with voters. That's you could criticize of voter registration for being a barrier, but it was a barrier because there was a problem.
Some people would say one of the purposes of voter registration was to actually filter out particular voters.
No, I mean, there's that other history too. But I'm not a Southerner, and the histories I'm more familiar with are histories where it was really more of an anti-machine,
Bill, role of Congress in terms of oversight here. We talked about Republican political appointees at justice. Removing the power of career officials to participate in hiring or to make recommendations with regard to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, presumably so that those recommendations wouldn't conflict with the recommendations of the political appointees. Have these policies been reversed? We've got a different Congress here. Have those policies been reversed? And, is Congress doing anything to give more authority to career people? And on the other hand, is that even a good thing? I mean, George Bush won the 2004 election. Do folks just have to kind of ride it out and replace the people?
Well, I mean, at least from my conversations with the people who are at Justice, who are in the Civil Rights Division, there has been change, and I think oversight has made a difference. I think shining a light on some of this stuff has made it very difficult to continue it. Has it all been stopped? No. A lot of the people who were hired for partisan purposes are still working there. And it's going to take a long time, I think, to undo some of the damage that's been done in recent years. But I do think that we're making progress, and I think it's very important for the oversight to continue. But oversight is only so effective. I mean, as we've watched this Attorney General survive appearance after appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee, you understand that you can push and push and push, but if there is an immovable object there, it's not going to happen. I think that the role of the career people is extremely important in voting. Because it's true, it's very difficult to take the politics out of politics. But we in the Justice Department, I think over the course of 30 or 40 years, had worked very hard to do it with regard to voting. Not always successfully, but there were an awful lot of checks in place to prevent direct partisan influence. And everything started from the bottom up, started with the career people. Career recommendations carried enormous weight. Everything was papered to death, memos, analysis. It was very hard for anybody to make a decision that was not carefully reasoned, wasn't well supported by the law, because it would have been quite obvious that that was what was happening. So I think that, what is going to be essential and what's going to come out of this oversight, I hope, and it may require getting a new Attorney General, new administration, is that we will reinstitute some of those safeguards that were developed over the years. And I think if we do that, we can get back to a far less partisan approach to administering federal voting laws.
And just a quick follow-up on that, kind of moving from oversight to reform. There are over 1 million people in this country who've completed their sentence. They can't vote. We got a president, George W. Bush, who extended the franchise to people in Texas who had served their time. Before, you had to wait at least 2 years after you'd served your time. The president got rid of that when he was governor of Texas. Right now, we've got a Democratic Congress, and the question is, in terms of, you know, these over 1 million people in places like Kentucky and Virginia who can't cast a ballot, who serve their time. Armenia is the only other nation in the world that does this, only other democracy in the world that does this. The question is, you know, is a Democratic Congress going to step up to the plate and, you know, do something about this issue and basically say, hey, to vote in federal elections, you know, people who have served their time should be able to vote in federal elections, or are, you know, is Democratic leadership just going to nervously say, oh, this is going to make us look liberal, it's a presidential year coming up, we've got to back away from protecting the voting rights of these disenfranchised
You just
souls.
answered the question for me. No, I think felon disenfranchisement is an outrage. I think that just being realistic about it, I think it is unrealistic to expect this Congress to be able to do anything about it. Don't forget that we have 50 functioning Democratic votes in the Senate, and the Republicans have made it very clear that it's going to take 60 votes to do anything. There is simply no way to muster 60 votes for a federal felon enfranchisement law. It's also, you know, it is a very difficult topic for most politicians to deal with. Most politicians, if a proposal is going to have the word felon in it, it had better end up putting more people in jail for longer periods, or they're not going to vote for it. So there is still, I think, an enormous education process that needs to go on, and I think the thing that we really need to do is to encourage the progress that we've seen in some of the states. But the prospects at the federal level are not great at this point, and I wouldn't put it all on the Democratic leadership. I would put it on the Republican leadership that we need 60 votes.
Let me underscore, especially for those of you who don't live in Washington, D.C., the progress that has been made in the states and the opportunity for more progress, and it is bipartisan. The voters in Rhode Island ended felony disenfranchisement on the ballot last year. And Florida, where there were 1 million people disenfranchised, the new governor of Florida, Crist, who's a Republican, overruled some of his own cabinet and pushed to end felony disenfranchisement and wound up basically creating the opportunity to restore voting rights for 500,000 people. The governor of Virginia, the Governor Kane, is a Democrat. He doesn't run for re-election. He has the same legal and constitutional power that the governor of Florida had to do the same exact thing. All he would have to do is sign his name, in effect, to the same document and say, I'm just doing what that guy did. So there are opportunities all across the country that are bipartisan to really make huge progress on this, and it's not necessary to wait for Congress.
I just wanted to say, in terms of a development that is positive, and that's another group of people who have been disenfranchised, residents of the District of Columbia, and there is some positive movement in Congress to address that in a limited way by giving our representative voting power and adding a seat for Utah. And I think that happened. It didn't happen because the Democrats in Congress exercised leadership. It happened because there was a grassroots movement by DC Vote and other activists to push the issue to the forefront. And if we want reforms at the federal level, I think we're going to have to start at the grassroots, and whichever political party is in control, they're not going to be exercising a lot of leadership on these kind of voting issues unless there's grassroots advocacy, because for many reasons, including the fact that they're incumbents, and so they don't have a lot of incentive to change the current system, but also because, you know, they're viewed as more technical, procedural issues, and we need to find a way to sort of light the fire of the American people that these aren't just about technical issues. This really is about who's in charge of our country.
So let's go ahead and do this. Let's open this up. Do we have a microphone that we can pass around?
With the growth of the absentee ballot, don't you see that there will be an erosion of individual right to vote from outside influence? And then to flip to another issue entirely is, do you think there has to be, and given Florida as an example, standardized ballot design?
On the different circumstances that absentee ballots are cast in, I think that is a real concern. But it just seems to me that in this day and age, people have made a choice that they're willing to tolerate that sort of potential, coercion, because somebody who's casting an absentee ballot might have somebody looking over their shoulder, might be being intimidated by a parent or a child or a relative or a neighbor or an employer. But we're all so busy now. We can't go to the polling places. And, precincts are expensive, so we don't have quite enough of them, and so on and so forth. And it's a balance that's moving the other way, and I think it's not one that people are taking seriously enough yet. I think there's going to have to be some blown open scandal involving people coercing absentee ballot casting in, a nursing home or a school or a college or something for people to really start paying attention to it.
Michael?
Well, the fact is, it is true that absentee voting or voting by mail does pose the bigger risk of fraud by individual voters than voting in election day. And really, with this, there is no single magic wand that you can wave. It may be a combination of things, ranging from no excuse absentee balloting, keeping the polls open for 2 days, moving election day, and all those other sorts of things. But going back to the question of why it is that in France they had 80% voter turnout and it was considered a major scandal that it had fallen off as much as it had. So these barriers do make a difference. Those states that have election day registration, in Montana and Iowa just changed to that this year, see a 5 to 7% increase in turnout over time. So in fact, the barriers change the mobilization strategies of campaigns and do make a difference.
Hi there. I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm a member of the bar of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. I'm proud of it. The Federalist Society gives Federalists a bad name. The Federalists, the New England Federalists of the late 18th century and early 19th century, believe that within the confines and checks and balances in the Constitution, that the national government should have a stronger role in affairs of our society. The Federalist Society, John Adams would be horrified and chagrined at it's giving true Federalists a bad name. The society that our conservative panelist belongs to ought to be called, they ought to call a spade a spade. It's the States' Rights Society. And
For anti-federalists myself.
And so that's something that does very much concern me, is the proud tradition of the Federalists is being given a bad name. And but a follow-up question on voting. I'm a disabled person, and I'm very concerned. What is happening is the presumption of the Holt bill is that DRE electric voting machines are inherently untrustworthy. Inherently untrustworthy. And that therefore we ought to go to optical scan equipment and replace all the DREs that have been bought under HAVA in the last 3-4 years with optical scan equipment. But they say that disabled people should still be allowed to vote on these untrustworthy DREs, which puts blind people and other disabled people in a stigmatized situation of voting on a machine that basically the bill says are untrustworthy. And I just wanted to get the panel's reaction on that.
Allison and then Michael. Just a quick note, could you give us some idea of this name thing with the Federalist Society, how that works? And then maybe, Michael, you can tell us a little bit about the DRE issue.
Well, like I said moments ago when I rather impolitely spoke over the questioner, I prefer the Anti-Federalist Society, but you know, if it's a contest between the Federalists and the Whigs, I'm also kind of a Whig. So I didn't name the organization. Some people at Chicago Law did, apparently millions of years ago. In any event, you should talk about DREs.
It's probably also true that Thomas Jefferson wouldn't be too thrilled with the Democratic Party either. So you know, it all, which is probably a good thing. The issue that the gentleman raises with the voting machines, we should probably unpack the acronyms and jargon. DREs are the touchscreen machines, and they are familiar to you if you use an ATM or have a Trio. The optical scan is in effect paper. It's like taking the SATs and you mark the ballot and it goes into an electronic machine and it reads it. And for obvious reasons, there are many more accommodations with current technology that can be built into DREs for people with disabilities, for blind people and others. And that is why we at the Brennan Center have not simply taken the position that some take, which is take all the DRE machines and throw them in a big bonfire. There may be some real benefits to having DREs. However, unless they have that kind of paper record or that kind of audit trail, they are insecure. And so the goal is to have either DREs or optical scan with that kind of record. And you know, there are technologies that will enable potentially optical scan machines also to be accessible. But there's a serious amount of underinvestment here at the local level. The local officials are concerned that they're being asked with an unfunded mandate to spend more money after everyone told them they had to rush out and buy these machines. These are the issues that are currently being negotiated. There's no perfect solution here. There are ways to make these machines accessible, but without kind of just trashing the whole thing and starting over.
I'm from the University of Oregon School of Law, and in my home state, vote by mail is pretty prevalent. And on one hand, we don't have the issue of long lines to the polls, which I would think would be most beneficial in those lower income neighborhoods where the concept of getting even an hour off from work in order to go stand in line and vote is unthinkable. So on one hand, we avoid that issue, but we still have other voter reg problems. And my question to the panel is, would you recommend vote by mail for other states? What are the problems that you think my state faces by having the vote by mail system?
Brenda, I think we're looking at you.
I don't think I know enough about how the Oregon system works to recommend it or not recommend it for other states. I mean, I know when it was first implemented, there was a concern about whether lower income people or maybe people that were less educated or have literacy issues would be able to access the vote by mail sort of system and do the paperwork and get it all done and get it in time. But it's been in place for a number of years, and I just don't know what the data shows in terms of the impact. I do know that there is good data from Oregon on verification of signatures, so there has not been a problem. And in fact, I think the data shows that actually if you train poll officials or election officials to match signatures as a form of ID, that's actually a higher sort of level of accuracy than if you require people to have photo IDs. So I think there is some good learning that's come out of Oregon, but I'm sorry, I don't have the up-to-date data on how it's been implemented and what its impact has been.
Penda, just quick follow-up. Where are you generally with things that may enhance certain populations, such as vote by mail, such as internet voting? These things might open up access for some populations, but may do so in a way that does not include everyone equally.
Well, and I think we have to be concerned. I think we have to be concerned about the impact of any so-called reform. In general, I'm in favor of opening access. I think that in general we have tended to restrict access to the franchise, but certainly we don't want to, adopt a certain opening up of access kind of provision that is going to apply mainly to privileged white voters without doing anything else to affect the populations that have been most traditionally excluded.
My name is Dustin Collier. I'm a student at Bolt Hall in Berkeley, California. So I believe Ms. Hayward said earlier that one of the reasons she thinks maybe there's a problem with voter turnout is cynicism. And I think that's absolutely true. When I talk to some voters, they say that they feel like they have to choose between two corrupt options. It's option A or option B, and they're both wrong. And so my question is, what do you think we can do to open up access more to third-party candidates, for, as far as them being excluded from debates, and in particular, instant runoff voting, which has a lot of potential for third-party candidates?
The Brennan Center has, over time, worked on access to the ballot for third-party candidates and for candidates who are often excluded from the ballot by carefully designed party rules. So that we, for example, represented Senator McCain and Steve Forbes when they were excluded from the ballot in New York by the Republican Party and the rules there. Instant runoff voting has a lot of promise. What that is, as you all may know, is a system where people basically rank the priorities of their candidates so that they don't feel they're wasting their vote. The problem with third parties throughout the American system, top to bottom, is just because of the math of it. When you have whoever comes in first wins, then you create a disincentive to not waste your vote on somebody who has no chance of winning. And so instant runoff voting, you could wind up having somebody who's everybody's second choice, but actually is much more popular and supported being the winner. I have personal skepticism about this because I think that we have a hard enough time with we should get the traditional voting right before we start trying to get all fancy with it. There is a simpler way to empower third parties, which we use in New York State and which other states, including Massachusetts, are looking at, which is cross-endorsement fusion voting. In New York, most places, a third party is not allowed to nominate the same candidate as one of the major parties. In New York, they are, so that you have, over time, the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, which is now defunct, or the Working Families Party, which is a liberal party. Their endorsements, in effect, matter quite a lot as signals, and you've actually had third-party candidates winning office. So there needs to be an opening up, certainly, in that. And there are ways to do it that don't go quite as far as instant runoff voting.
We've got two questions over here, and we're going to have the two questions asked, and then the panelists respond.
My name's Brian McPherson. I had the eye-opening experience for the last two general elections to volunteer with the Election Protection Hotline. And if anyone wants to get a sample of the types of election problems people have, you can look on their website. I mean, it ranges up to people who voted for 50 years and find they go to the polls and they're told they aren't registered, they haven't moved, nothing's changed. But check out their website if you're interested. My question, though, it relates to the Florida re-enfranchisement effort by the governor. Did that change the law, or did that just re-enfranchise those who had been convicted previously of felonies in a way where it would have to be repeated periodically to catch people who have been convicted since that time.
I'm Ben George from the University of Georgia. I heard somebody mention states' rights earlier, and it kind of reminded me of last year when Ken Millman, a loyal Bushy and a fan of the Federalist Society, apologized for the Southern strategy, insinuating perhaps that when Ronald Reagan announced for presidency in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, on a states' rights platform, that it wasn't, coincidence. But 2 weeks ago, I've read a story, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and I haven't read the case, but in Mississippi, again, there was a case where a judge that happened to be Trent Lott's roommate upheld a provision that would mandate that you have to choose your party to vote in a primary. And either is this perhaps a nascent Southern strategy again, because the idea in the article was that it would polarize the parties completely on racial lines, and maybe a little bit of the famed unholy alliance in there as well.
Panelists?
Well, on the party registration, can I ask for a little bit of clarification? You have to be registered in a party to vote in that party's primary?
No, right now they have an open primary. It's similar in Georgia,
Okay.
where you don't have to be registered
Right.
in a certain party. So the thought is that
And the decision was that
I think it was a state law that was upheld.
Okay.
I don't know if it was a federal court decision or not.
Because does anybody know additional? Because typically what the court has said is that the state cannot force upon a political party associations with people that political party doesn't want to associate with. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, it was a front page story in the New York Times. African American Democrats brought the suit, and the impact, according to the observers quoted, is it will force non-African American voters into the Republican primary. That's what the theory is. The U.S. Supreme Court said political parties have First Amendment associational rights to decide who gets to vote in a primary. Now, the interesting thing I've never seen advance the fact is many of these primaries are run with state election funding. Yeah, but that's not considered state action, which is interesting, too. Yeah.
Some of those issues may get litigated, at least inferentially, in a case the Brennan Center is arguing in October before the Supreme Court on the selection of judges in New York State called Lopez-Torres, where a lot of those issues are at play. The action by the governor in Florida was through his clemency power. And it's a good question. I don't know whether the next governor needs to do it again. But it will hold. It's not one by one, but it's across the categories. And again, I just want to reinforce for folks, there are opportunities not only in the felony disenfranchisement area, but in voter ID, voter registration, election day registration, all across the country this year and next in the states to make positive changes that could affect politics next year and beyond.
We got a set of two more questions here.
Hi, my name is Josh Lowe. I'm from the state of Maryland. I was wondering if the panel could comment briefly on the effect of organizations like the American Center for Voting Rights in building the case, I guess, for the existence of voter fraud.
And also, what happened to the American Center for Voting Rights?
Hi, my name is Brian Dupre. I'm a law student at the University of Texas. I wanted to ask you, back on the voter ID topic, there was a Indiana voter ID law that was upheld by the Seventh Circuit, and I wanted to know if you thought that decision was correct, and if it were to go to the Supreme Court, how you thought that might turn out.
We'll play rock, paper,
Is this
scissors.
a multiple
for it.
choice test or take home?
I mean, I think the disappearance of the American Center for Voting Rights is fascinating, and the disappearance of Thor Hearn along with it, I think, is fascinating. There has been, again, I think this is probably a result of some of the oversight that's been done, and the fact that people have become aware of what has been happening in the enforcement of voting laws. And obviously the American Center for Voting Rights was was a product that was created out of whatever to push this notion that there was a great deal of vote fraud and that we needed extraordinary responses, including photo ID laws. I think that people who have pushed that notion are feeling a little bit of heat, but I don't know the particular circumstances of what happened to them.
Their website got taken down
Yeah.
very suddenly one day.
Yeah.
Seventh Circuit. Penda, any
Well,
thoughts?
I mean, I'm always reluctant to comment on sort of Supreme Court strategy if I'm not the lawyer in the case, because I feel like that those folks know the record and know much more than I do about the strategy for that case. What my understanding is that may not be the strongest case against voter ID to go to the Supreme Court, and therefore I would hope that the folks that are litigating the case and that are making the strategy decision sort of take into account the bigger picture. I mean, I know that that civil rights organizations work together, and we try to make sure that the strongest cases are the ones that get pushed forward on appeal, and sometimes you need to sort of slow down or detrack other cases if the likelihood is they're going to make bad law. And I just don't know enough about the Indiana record to comment any further than that. That doesn't, no, it's not your case. That doesn't mean that something can't happen.
West Glebe, Pennsylvania. I think, Michael, you said something about the government registering everybody when they were 18. Could you say something about the up and the downside of having to vote, having everybody in the country have to vote? Doesn't Canada have that?
Okay. And so Australia question, and then we're going to have a second question as well.
Yes, you may be familiar with, I would certainly recommend, Rolling Stone magazine last summer had an article by Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., How Bush Stole the 2004 election. There was a follow-up a couple months later. From what you know, I can't go into all the details of the question here, but would you say it is likely that the total of errors in Ohio could have wound up actually changing the results of the 2004 presidential election, thereby sending it into Bush's victory?
I'll take a stab at that. Yes, I do. And I was very upset, and this is not a partisan statement, but I was very upset when the candidate who allegedly didn't win in Ohio conceded the election, because I felt that we in the civil rights and voting rights community had been in Ohio, had worked really hard to fix the problems or identify the problems before the election, and were ready, on election day and after election day to go in and scrutinize further how the election had happened. But you can't do that very effectively or when there's been a concession. And so I think that although we did a lot, we're still doing follow-up work on that Ohio election and are still trying to get things like the provisional ballot envelope so we can see why people's provisional ballots were rejected. But, it was, in some ways, Florida in 2000 gave the lawyers a lot more ability to sort of go in right after the election and dig into the problems than what happened in Ohio in 2004.
Without commenting, because I don't feel I have the basis for commenting on the question of what happened in 2004, there's again a real significant opportunity for positive change in Ohio. The new Secretary of State, Jennifer Bruner, is one of 12 new Secretaries of State elected on election reform platforms. And we, the Brennan Center, are working with Cleveland State University to study the system there and make recommendations. She is pledged and is very strong on fixing a lot of the problems going forward.
I was going to say something about the compulsory voting question, which is, if we did have compulsory voting, that would be one way we pretty much have to also have a fairly clean and accurate voter roll, because now not only are you talking about perhaps detecting fraud in voting, but you're also trying to enforce a rule that people vote. I don't think that if Congress enacted a mandatory voting law, that it would be constitutional. But let's suppose I'm wrong, or let's suppose there's a constitutional amendment. What happens in some countries that have mandatory voting is, sure, people will vote, but they will vote a blank ballot. So you've got this administrative headache on top of, but not necessarily any more voting, real voting, than you'd see if voting was discretionary.
Wouldn't none of the above column account for that?
Well, I'm not sure in Australia they have a none of the above. Do you know?
Nevada does.
I know Nevada does, yeah.
And also, I would also point out, what you say is an administrative problem. People skip offices all the time.
No, but I mean, people as a matter of protest against the mandatory voting blank ballots.
I'd say just two things about it. One is that we have to pay taxes and serve on juries, so there's an equally strong argument that we have to vote. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think realistically the libertarian strain in the country is so strong that it's something that will be far from happening ever. Australia did begin as a penal colony, let's not forget.
Like Georgia.
What I want to do just kind of quickly in wrapping this up is, this is a, important group of people who are active in voting rights, focus on it. You all have the privilege to say 2 sentences to them, just kind of parting big thoughts here. What are the, couple things that you would want to convey to this, group of important folks from the voting rights community and the civil rights community and public interest law generally?
Well, I would encourage you to stay active, and I would encourage you to take advantage of the opportunities that you've heard up here today. And Michael has mentioned a couple, I know, and there certainly are opportunities at the state and local level, which is where an awful lot of the election activity will and should happen. So I guess my advice to you would be not to focus on us in Congress so much as the people who actually make a difference on the ground.
And I just want to echo that. Advancement Project is now involved in 8 states, and we hope to be involved in 10 to 12 by 2008. We're already getting ready for the 2008 election. But we believe that pre-election work, really scrutinizing both whether the laws are being complied with, whether there are areas of discretion where state and local officials can exercise discretion for voters instead of against voters, and then getting involved in campaigns, strategic campaigns to change certain laws or rules, is a way that we can all really make a difference now. And so I would encourage you to visit our website for tools to use in your own communities, or talk with us about working with us in those communities where we are involved, because there is a lot of work that can be done in the next 18 months to make the 2008 election one of the most inclusive ones that we've ever had.
That's right. And in addition to that, whoever the next president is, whoever wins the election, we are never going to get the change that will be promised if we don't change the democracy. We're not going to be able to deal with taxes or climate change or income inequality or health care or anything if we don't have more people voting, fix these systems, deal with the other democracy issues. It's that important.
I have 2. One, volunteer as a precinct judge or precinct worker in your precinct. Talk to your Secretary of State, your Registrar of Voters, whoever takes care of that. You don't have to do it forever. You don't have to do it until you're 85. But do it for a couple of rounds, and you'll get an intuition about the problems, and I think you'll also be better precinct judges than probably a lot of the other people who are volunteering. Second is, no, I'm not to cast aspersions, but a lot of them, at least in my community, are older people who are not so. Setting that aside. Second thing is, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Have realistic expectations about what you can do.
All right, well, panelists, thank you all very much. Certainly learned a lot. I'd just like to make one point, which would be these rules seem neutral. They aren't. We really do have to question rules that seem just very neutral and innocent. But thank you all very much for coming. And